Hey everyone, welcome to today's video where we're going to update on AMD's expected MI300 and successor sales in 2025 and 2026 in order to understand where the stock price is going. And in order to do that, we need to understand the AMD's allocation at the manufacturing partner TSMC, both in terms of the GPU manufacturing and the packaging of that GPU. Once we look at those numbers, we are able to calculate how fast the MI300 ramped, which started in late 2023, their first venture in the AI market, and then continue with the MI355X that just recently launched and got a lot of new reviews and quite satisfied customers on a broad spectrum from Meta and talks about Oracle and so on. And then also looking at the potential ramp-up phase of the up-and-coming MI400, which would be the first real try at challenging Nvidia, like on almost eye-to-eye level in my view. I mean, MI300 was a good first try. It wasn't a fully dedicated AI chip. It's like a mix between HPC and AI. Remember, HPC stands for high performance computing, applications such as weather forecasting and stuff like that, whereas AI is relying on less precision. So before we look at the numbers, we can see that last year there was an article from the Register in which they mentioned AMD's total output of 2024, which roughly sums up to around 300 to 330,000 MI300s across the main four customers, which were in that case Meta, Microsoft, Oracle and TensorWave. We can also see there's a lot of discussions now recently about AMD potentially trying to partner up with OpenAI. There's a lot of discussions between AMD at high levels, with Lisa Su essentially meeting with Sam Altman of OpenAI, and some rumors, some media out there are talking about potential 50-50 split between AMD and Nvidia for OpenAI. I'm not sure about that, but even a 20-80 split for AMD would mean like the world. We can also, before looking at the actual numbers, look at some of the latest developments. We can see that last week AMD took the covers of the new Instinct MI355X accelerator according to Signal65 on Twitter. And we can see here that it's actually performing 10% faster than the previous MI300X, but remember, it's 10% faster only with 8 MI355Xs compared to 32 MI300s. So it's essentially 5 times faster per GPU. We can also see, as I mentioned on the earnings as well, AMD is talking about broad, interest for the MI355X and MI400, and I believe this is due to the potential customers seeing that AMD developing very well and very fast, both on the software with ROCm6 and ROCm7 on the software side, and obviously on this very continuous roadmap of every single year from MI355X to MI400, and there's also rumors about MI500 and MI600. So there's a lot of interest from the customers, and we can also see that AMD increased potentially the price of MI355X by 40%. I think this is the right move in my opinion. They supply limited to a huge extent in as far as I understand, and they're really competitive with Blackwell B200 and B300. So I don't see the reason why they shouldn't raise the price at the current state in order also to give them more resources to work with on R&D for the future. And also finally we can see that AMD has really potentially large order coming on from Meta at around 300,000. At least that's the rumors, that Meta wants 300,000 MI355Xs this year. Problem is that also on the same rumors, they're talking about potential capacity from AMD around 50 to 80,000. And that 50 to 80,000 MI355Xs, we have to understand that, does it mean that that's AMD's total capacity for this year? Or is it the allocation that they have allocated to obviously Facebook and Meta? Difficult to say. And just to keep you updated also, we know that Oracle signed a deal of around 30,000 cluster of MI355Xs earlier in this year. On the table here we can see that starting from 2023 Q4, which was the first quarter of MI300, and then ramping up in terms of million US dollar, in this case 400, 600, 1100 and so on and so forth. And those numbers are, rough estimates. So we have to remember that on Q1 of 2024 earnings report, Lisa Su mentioned that AMD had managed to sell over $1 billion of MI300, which was by then the fastest ramping AMD chip of all time. Then in Q2 of that year, so Q2 of last year, she mentioned that they, on that single quarter, managed to sell in excess of $1 billion. And then based on, the data center revenue that they came in, remember that AMD mixes up the data center sales with their CPU and the GPUs. So based on that, I estimated 1600, so 1.6 billion in Q3 of last year, 1.9 in Q4, which means that by then still the CPU side of AMD's AI market was dominating. So here on this red part of the table, on the line 119 and onwards, you can see that I've updated, so you can see the Instinct, which is the GPU sales on row 120, and you can also see the EPYC sales, the CPU server for AMD. And until Q2 of 2025, the EPYC Zen CPUs are still outselling the, MI300 GPUs. Now, it was very close, in my opinion, in Q4 of last year, neck and neck. But then I would say that, in Q1 of this year and Q2 of this year, since MI300 is becoming quite old, I mean, it's only a year and a half old, but in this market, it's very old. Like, it was meant to compete with Nvidia H100, and now it's competing, obviously, within a market with the B200 and B300. So that's why we're starting to see, weak sales for MI300. But that's not a big worry because MI355X is just, ramping up. And speaking of MI355X, remember that on this recent call last week, Lisa Su actually mentioned that MI355X is even ramping faster than, the MI300X. So now we have a product that is ramping up faster than the fastest ever product of all time, which was MI300X. So that's successor MI355X. I'm expecting to, on the first quarter, like on the first full quarter. I mean, they probably sold a few on Q2 of this year, but I would say that on the first full quarter of ramping up, if she's saying that it's significantly faster ramp up than MI300, I assume that it's around 1 billion or so in Q3. That's my assumption, which also means that I'm assuming that MI300 sales will go down again sequentially from 1140 around, my estimates to 800. Combined data center sales for Q3 should be around 1800 from the GPUs, and go into that other table and see how much we are expecting from the CPUs. So if you add them together, around 1800 in Q3 and around 2200 on the EPYC side, we get around 4 billion or so on the data center. So already like 23% quarter-over-quarter growth on the data center. Obviously, half of it is essentially from the CPUs. But this video is about the AI GPU market, right? So if we get around 1 billion in, let's say, ramping up in Q3, I'm hoping that they can manage to do double that in Q4. Sounds like a lot, but remember that they're already done like around 2 billion or so of MI300 in Q4 of last year. So I don't see any reason why they wouldn't be able to do 2 billion of MI355X in Q4 of this year, a year later. Especially, when she's saying that it's ramping up much faster, and we get signals from the market that a lot of customers are interested in this MI355X, and also the important fact that they actually somehow managed to increase the price by assumingly 40%. I mean, in a weak demand market, they wouldn't obviously do that, right? So something tells me that these rumors are correct. So going back to these numbers again, I'm hoping for 2 billion of MI355X and around $500 million from MI300X, which leaves us with $2,600 million of AI GPU sales by Q4 of this year. And that leads us to the first time ever that AMD overtakes their EPYC CPU server sales by their, Instinct GPUs. For the first time ever, I expect them to do that in Q4 of this year. And that would be a very, very healthy data center sales of around 5.7 billion, let's say $5.5 billion, which is absolutely bonkers for a company like AMD, because that's going to translate to significant amount of, let's say, earnings per share, right? I mean, with those numbers, I mean, if we expect them to do like 5.5 billion or so data center sales in Q4 of this year, we're expecting AMD to have our earnings per share at least at the very minimum at around 1.1 or 1.2 maybe US dollar. All these numbers realistic. So where are these numbers coming from? Well, there was an article coming out a few, let's say, weeks ago in which I believe Morgan Stanley is talking about the capacity booking from the customers of TSMC, the main one when it comes to the AI packaging, Nvidia. Nvidia is supposed to have around 60% of their capacity, which translates to just under 600,000 wafers for the entire year of 2026. AMD in their turn are supposed to have booked around 80 to 100,000 CoWoS from TSMC. So essentially 1/6 to 1/7 of the capacity of Nvidia. Let's say between 15 to 18% of Nvidia's capacity in terms of packaging. So based on that Morgan Stanley report of around 80,000 CoWoS wafers that AMD has booked for 2026, that would translate to around, I mean, it depends a little bit on how you calculate the yield, and I've shown on my past couple of videos, if you're interested, look into those to look at the detailed calculations, how we arrive at these numbers. But based on, assuming that it's a 3nm process for the compute chiplets and still a 6nm process for the IO die, which is quite mature processes, especially on the 6nm one on the IO dies, and also the CoWoS packaging. So once you have your chiplets, like your GPU dies and your memory and all this kind of stuff, the estimated yield on that packaging step is quite high. So my assumption is that for each of those 80,000 wafers, AMD could combine manufacture around 700,000 MI355Xs. I mean, it's quite a lot of detailed mathematics. I might be completely wrong, but I do believe that for, let's say, 500,000 to 700,000 is in the right ballpark. Why do I say that? Well, we have at least some history on AMD sales, right? So if you look at this other table here, going back to the first quarter that AMD sold the MI300, right? They booked around 500 million, 400 to 500 million or so revenue on that quarter, average sales price assuming around $15,000. That would give them around 30,000 MI300Xs. Then we had that article that mentioned AMD selling around, I believe, if I recall this, like, what was it, like 320, 330,000 here, according to the register for full year of 2024, right? And you can see here that on the Q1, they had around 600 million revenue. That would be around 40,000 units. And if you do the math based on the around 5 billion or so revenue that they had in last year, that would be around, based on average sales price of 15,000, let's say 350,000 MI300s, which is roughly in the same ballpark as these guys at the register are calculating. So I think the numbers are, with very rough estimates, in the right ballpark. This year, the revenue is expected to be around 7.5, let's say to 8 billion maybe. Let's say between 6.5 to 8 billion, right? Somewhere in there for 2025. And that would mean, again, with the same calculation, maybe 500,000 of MI300s and MI355Xs. You can see that number here. The units at on this column N, I highlighted the number of chips sold. So let's say they go from 350 or 300,000 to 500,000 from 2024 to 2025, which is quite realistic. And for next year, I'm assuming that they're gonna, maybe this, I have to update this number obviously. I mean, 1 billion maybe slightly too high. I would say anywhere between 700,000 to 1 million or so, which would be around 20 billion or so in revenue. That's my estimations. And how would that look like? I mean, so we can see that by 2025 Q3, we are clearly seeing that MI300 will ramp down, MI355X will ramp up. And then this ramping up would look like something like this. Remember, this is the fastest ramping AMD product of all time. And then by 2026, I'm assuming that it's going to be late Q2, potentially early Q2. I mean, there's some rumors that AMD is pulling in that MI400X. Maybe they are starting to see some benefits of that chiplet strategy where they will have, let's say, at least half a year maybe advantage ahead of Nvidia, since they are, with the design, with the chiplet design, are able to access the nodes faster than Nvidia can. Long story short, if you're interested in the details, look at my previous couple of videos that goes more into the details regarding why AMD will access the more state-of-the-art nodes of TSMC ahead of Nvidia. And long story short, it's depending on the size of the chip. Nvidia goes for a big one, AMD goes for many smaller one and combine them together. And that single change potentially allows them to tap into TSMC's newer nodes like 2 nanometer and maybe 16 angstrom faster than half a year ahead of Nvidia. In any case, that ramping up would look like something like this. And then I'm expecting that by 2026, MI400X will maybe be at around 2 billion. Again, my suspicion with everything, listening to the market, looks like MI400 will be the first real threat to Nvidia. Not in terms of like volume sales. I mean, Nvidia will still like outsell AMD by multiple times. On the pure technical terms, I think MI400 is gonna give Nvidia a run for its money. It's potentially, I mean, arguably as good if not better. And you are able to, for the first time when it comes to AMD, to truly access like large amount of nodes, like, 10,000, 100,000 GPU parks together, like servers, like the one that, for example, CoWoS at XAI, sitting around 200,000. I think AMD will be able to do something like that as well. So a year from now, Q2 should be almost 5 to 6 billion just from the AI GPUs. And by Q4 of next year, almost 8 billion AI GPUs. And that combines up to around, we can see the numbers there, like Q2 of 2026, 90,000 MI400Xs, scaling up to 160,000 and then 250,000. Obviously, I'm assuming MI400 will have even higher premium, maybe 25,000 US dollar. There are some rumors out there, potentially 30. I mean, if MI355 goes for that and Nvidia is already charging at times 50,000-60,000, why not? So there's a lot of upside when it comes to this. What would a quarter look like for AMD? A potential Q4 of next year, right? Data center, I'm expecting around 10 to 10.5 billion for Q4 of next year. Potentially a bit too optimistic, maybe, yeah. But let's go with 10 billion, 10.5 billion. On the client side, I actually think AMD are finally starting to eat into Intel's dominance. When it comes to the gaming, on the CPU side, there are some really interesting products coming out from Intel, and early rumors are that they are for once looking good. So I'm being quite conservative on the gaming side, essentially same revenue as almost like what I'm expecting for Q4 of 2025. So no development there at all. And then embedded still stuck around 1 billion, 980 billion. So most of the revenue coming from the client increase and the data center. And just looking at, what it would mean, obviously cost of sales would go up because the revenue goes up, but then the gross profit would go from like 5 billion to 8 billion. Then the operating expenses are allowed an increase of $500 million or so, most of it going to R&D expenses, that is, and also marketing. So that's good. They need to spend that money on marketing and R&D to catch up with Nvidia as much as possible. And that would lead us to a net income of around 3.5 billion or so Q4 of next year, which means around 2 or so US dollar earnings per share. A company in this space potentially coming in at around 8 to 10 US dollar earnings per share on another run rate by late next year. I think this is super undervalued. I honestly think that I mean I would easily pay 50 times price to earnings ratio for this company. I mean, if Palantir is like being valued that highly, like what is it, like 80 times price to sales or something crazy like that, I could easily pay 50 times for a company like AMD, so diversified. And we haven't still talked about the potentials of their, let's say, embedded, the legacy Xilinx software and the FPGAs that is still kind of stagnating a little bit since they bought them. Remember that Xilinx is doing around 800 million right now. At one time, a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, they were doing 1.5 billion every single quarter, high margin. Like they would make operating profits based on that 1.5 billion of like 600, 700, 800 million or so. That's gonna do it for today. I just wanted to show you how the AMD product, execution is on there. I mean, we've seen realistic delivery numbers for 2024 in terms of number of chips that they managed to sell. We see that the interest for from the companies like OpenAI and Oracle is there. We see MI355X like getting quite a lot of improvement compared to the previous version of MI300X, and we also see that it's just like quite a lot of interest on the MI400 already for next year. In addition to that, they increased the price of each MI355X by around 40%. So that is really nice margins potentially. And it's just, I simply don't see why this company is valued at this kind of level. Long story short, I think AMD has quite a lot of potential. And remember, all these calculations are based on 2026. Like 2027 is not far away. If MI400 really like hits the nail on everything, this company could easily build on that and do double that again in 2027. Remember that they already doubled, they increased their number of chips sold on AI segment from 300,000, 330,000 potentially to 500,000 already this year. Next year, by the rumors, they're doubling their allocation at TSMC, which means that they're potentially getting in more than twice their revenue, because I think they're gonna sell them at higher average sales price. And if they do that again in 2027, this company could do like 30, 40, 50 billion US dollar in revenue just from AI. That's essentially really, like, I don't know, like if AMD does 40 billion revenue from AI GPUs in 2027, that's gonna be probably 3, 4, 5 US dollar earnings per share every single quarter. Then this company could easily go to 800 US dollar by all means. So in any way, that was a very long video. Please like, subscribe, comment in the comment section. Do you agree with me in terms of my speculation of how many chips they will be able to sell in 2026? And thank you for your time, and see you in the next one.